last time when we stopped, we were looking at modern art, and we had stopped with Dada. And I want to talk to you just a little bit about what Dada is. Dada was really a lifestyle. It was really a way of looking at life. It was not just an art style. The Dada artists developed during World War I and right after. And they really reacted to World War I by saying, that the war had seemed very irrational after hundreds of centuries of European culture supposedly developing a humanistic society in which humans were valued. Then we got into a war where people were murdered with new machines such as the airplane. And it just seemed very irrational to them. It seemed to be just the opposite of what we were supposed to be doing in European culture. And so the Dadaists decided that what we needed to do was start over entirely. Wipe out all institutions. They advocated revolt, war, similar sorts of things to the futurists, except they were a little more restrained with advocating violence because they had lived through a very violent time. But they felt like we needed to wipe the slate clean and we needed to start over again. And so they adopted the attitude of anything that described European culture before this period, they had to do the opposite. So since people in the past had always been evaluated based upon how rational they were, the Dadaists said, well, everybody should be irrational. Rationality didn't work. So maybe irrationality will work. And so that sort of was the basis for their life. And it meant that artists like Marcel Duchamp, that you see here, and we talked about him last time, they deliberately went about creating art, and actually he didn't want to even say he created art anymore. He thought that was too traditional. They went about adopting or creating images that were supposed to be the opposite of what centuries in the past had done in terms of art. And so in terms of sculpture, instead of creating sculpture out of the usual materials of the past, of stone or wood, bronze, he said, forget those materials. That didn't work. That culture, it came out of a culture that didn't work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find objects that have already been made, manufactured in factories, and I am going to adopt those and present them in exhibits and places where I know that people are probably going to come in and say, is that art? I know an artist created this. And it'll get people to thinking about what is art, what's the true importance of art, and where does art really come from? Because he could say, I had nothing to do with making this. And what he realized was, and it's still the case today, a lot of times we look at artworks and we make a decision about how skillful they've been created. And usually, the standard is, does it look like something? Does it really look like the same object we could see in our real world? If it does, then I'm going to assume that that artist must have a lot of skill, and so he must be a really good artist. But what Duchamp was saying was that's just twisting things around. That's evaluating art based upon just skill. And he more or less was suggesting, and you can ask art teachers and they will say the same thing, that any person can be taught the skills of creating art, but it still will not make them creative. It still does not make them have the ability to come up with concepts and ideas in their mind. And so he was trying to say, by adopting these manufactured objects that he had nothing to do with making, that skill was unimportant. It was more important to look at the artist's mind and the concepts and his imagination and his creativity, and to evaluate that within a work of art. And so he began to adopt these manufactured objects. He had a great influence on the future. There are other artists in the Surrealist movement that we're going to talk about next, in later 20th century art that will adopt junk, will adopt, objects that were already made by somebody else for another function, and then will combine them into something that could be called art. So that leads us to Surrealism. Surrealism was influenced by Dada, but Surrealism had another very important influence, and that influence was Freud. Freud had written a number of books in the 1890s and the 1900s. One of the books that he had written was The Interpretation of Dreams. And that made Surrealist artists become very interested in sort of the subconscious mind, not the rational, conscious, everyday mind that we all use. So in a way, they were also, looking beyond ordinary life, back towards, another level of life, and saying that that level of life was worth creating art about, as well as just what we see in our everyday life. There are two different trends of Surrealism. You see the first one here in this artist. His name is Juan Miro. Miro. It is a man, even though it looks like Joan. And sometimes students, misunderstand and think this is a woman, but it is a man. He was from Barcelona, Spain, which is in the region of Catalan, and they speak Spanish slightly different, and they also spell it slightly different. So in most of the rest of Spain, his first name would have been spelled J-U-A-N instead of J-O-N-A-N. Well, he was particularly interested in creating a more abstracted sort of art that would somehow unlock the subconscious or express the subconscious. He was also very influenced by children's folk tales and sort of children's art, and wanted to sort of fashion a kind of art that would have a childlike quality about it, such as you see here. So he created these very distorted sorts of images. This is supposed to be a cat, a striped sort of cat playing with a rope that is another cat is hanging on to, or sometimes people think this is a mouse, that he's trapped with a rope. Then we have this strange sort of image, of something that looks a little like a human, but he has a horn sticking out of one side of his head with a caduceus on it, which is a symbol for doctors. Has a very long neck, has a strange sort of face to him. And so he just creates these scattered, sort of abstracted kinds of images. Another artist, probably a more famous artist that works in Surrealism, is Salvador Dali. And he worked in a different kind of Surrealism that sometimes is called illusionistic Surrealism, or it's called magic realism. And it is very much based upon Freud's ideas of dreams. And Dali talks about how there are different levels of reality, and that he's trying to express these different levels of reality. And so again, he creates objects. They look much more representational than we saw in Miro, but they're still acting very strangely. They're doing very, funny things. Here are clocks that are in metal cases, and it actually looks like it's metal, except, they're bending and they're curving, they're limp. Metal cases would not be limp. And so he's distorting reality. He's saying, this is another level of reality that I am showing you here. It's not just your ordinary sort of reality. This is a self-portrait of him. He had very long eyelashes and a very pointy nose, and he was pretty bald. And so he has this sort of looking like some kind of cloth, or some people say it looks like sand that's blown over something. He had a wax mustache, and he's turned that into a watch here on his face. And so he's distorting objects, and he called his method the paranoid critical method. And what he meant by that, he said, was, I see one thing while normal people see other things. For example, he might say, you see a chair. I see a horse. And so he's trying to metamorphose and change things, to take ordinary objects and say they have a different kind of life. They just don't have ordinary sorts of life. Surrealists are also very interested in putrefaction, in decaying, rotting things. They were very interested in sort of sexual aberrations. And so the idea of sort of rotting, decaying things is represented here in this work by this watch that has ants crawling around it. And he liked to use ants a lot, which you do see, in any matter that you see rotting. You'll see ants carrying away bits and pieces of it. So the surrealists, create a very new, creative sort of style. Another example of a surrealist artist is René Magritte, who was an artist from Belgium that worked in Paris for a while with some of the other artists. And he also, chose to create images that contradict what they originally look like. We're looking obviously at an eyeball, staring directly at it. And so we would probably expect, to see the color of the eyeball here, but instead he shows us clouds and sky, as if he's reflecting in the eye what the eye is seeing, looking out at the sky. So again, like Dali, he tries to suggest there are different levels or different kinds of reality. And all the surrealists were sort of trying to say, open up your minds, don't just expect the ordinary sort of thing. Realize that there's much more discrepancies and contradictions in the world than we tend to think about usually. The surrealists led to the last style that I'm going to show you for the 20th century. And I want to mention that this is actually in the next chapter of your book. We've been talking about the art that is in chapter 21, I believe, of your book, the early 20th century art. And this style is actually included in the next chapter, which is a chapter that talks about later 20th century art, art since 1945. But I include it in the lecture on modernism because many scholars who study 20th century art really believe that abstract expression is the last of these early 20th century styles that develops. It has many things in common with earlier art. Art by Kandinsky, for example, that we talked about for German Expressionism. It is an expressionistic style, so it's similar to the art like Vincent van Gogh created and like we then talked about for the French artists in Fauvism and in Germany, the German Expressionists. And so many people, and it is non-objective art, and non-objective art is really seen as being the most significant style or direction for art that develops in the early 20th century, in which artists reject representational images. And for the most part, that is the kind of art that is created by the abstract expressionists. And I want to mention that as it starts out, and one of the foremost artists of abstract expression was a man named Jackson Pollock, and you're seeing one of his early works here. He was very influenced by surrealism, and so in his early abstract expressionist works, there are vague figures that are there. This work is called The Guardians of the Spirit, and usually these two vertical forms that you see on either side are referred to as the guardians. They're very abstracted to the point, that on this side you really hardly see anything that looks representational at all. Here, maybe this looks a little bit more like a head and then like shoulders here and a body. And then another very abstracted but representational sort of image is this image down here, which apparently represents the spirit. And it seems to be almost animal-like, and in fact, some people have said that it looks like a rabbit, that this is sort of the head of the rabbit and then the big tall ears. Other people have said, no, it's a bird and this is the beak, that the head of the bird is lying down here on the bottom and that the beak is sticking up. So it's a sort of ambiguous kind of figure that the surrealists would have liked, and that really sort of suggests different levels of meaning and different levels of reality. So surrealism influenced, as well as expressionist styles that we've talked about, influenced the development of abstract expression. And in its full-blown form, in most of the artists that are associated with abstract expression, it becomes fully non-objective. Even though the style is called abstract, and we've defined that to mean that there's still something representational in it, although it's very distorted or simplified. In most of the works that are created by the abstract expressionists, there isn't anything representational anymore. It's just paint on canvas. And there are two different subcategories of this style. There's one style, category that's called gestural expression, and that's really what Jackson Pollock is creating here. You really get a sense of the movement of his arm and his body as he moves around this canvas, and he pours, these little threads of paint onto the canvas. It really does seem very expressionistic. You really get a feeling of his emotions that made him move as he moved around the canvas with the paint. And then there's another subcategory of abstract expression that's represented by this work. This artist used very large fields of color. You only have a little sense of movement on the edges, where the irregular edges that really show that he painted, with a brush. But you have these very big fields of color, and these are large works. They're probably about the size of floor to ceiling here in the front of this room. And he was influenced by Carl Jung's idea about the collective unconscious of human beings and some of the symbolism that Carl Jung talks about. And these are, much less active. There's not lots of movement in them, and they're works that we're supposed to sort of meditate about, and you're supposed to just sort of sink into. But they're still non-objective. They still show a kind of expression, but it's a much calmer, it's much quieter sort of expression that Rothko creates. So that brings us to the end of discussing the styles of the early part of the 20th century. And so with our next class, we'll begin to talk about styles that developed after 1945 in the latter half of the century into the first part of the 21st century.